Dr. Brittany Seymour and Dr. Alessandra Vila talk with us today about dental medicine and internet communications. I think it's going to be a really fascinating topic. And I also would like to welcome Dean Donoff. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Donoff is the Dean of Harvard School of Dental Medicine. For those live stream viewers who would like to submit a question, please submit your questions on our Facebook comment section. If you're watching on YouTube, you can submit your question through YouTube, and you may also ask us a question through our Twitter account. So whether we're talking about oral health or a patient's overall health, the growing popularity of the internet and social media outlets has put a wealth of information at our fingertips. As you well know, a single post on Facebook can just shoot around the world in seconds. And sometimes that information is accurate and sometimes it is not. Also, health information is one of the most frequently searched topics on Google. And Google searches a broad swath of content, and it's all unfiltered. So sometimes you'll have access to peer-reviewed data, and often you'll get information to data that lacks documentation. So what do we do about this? How do we sift through fact from myth? Today's speakers from the Harvard School of Dental Medicine will share their views and focus on misperceptions that can be a contagion on the internet. They're going to give us a number of examples, and in particular, they'll touch on water fluoridation and vaccinations. Dr. Brittany Seymour is an assistant professor of oral health policy and epidemiology at the Harvard School of Dental Medicine. She was an inaugural Global Health Institute Fellow, a Harvard Medical School Fellow in Medical Education, and is a faculty associate at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Dr. Alessandro Vila is an instructor in oral medicine at Harvard School of Dental Medicine. He is also an associate surgeon in the Division of Oral Medicine and Dentistry at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He holds a Master's of Public Health and a certificate in oral medicine from Harvard School of Dental Medicine and Brigham Women's Hospital. I'd like to thank Heather Denny for helping us arrange this talk at 12. And I want you to join me, please, in welcoming today's guests. Thank you.
I'm going to probably walk around a bit. You can hear me okay? Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and for coming today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I'm going to start us with a quiz because I teach and this is what I do. So you don't get off easy. How many pieces of content do you think get shared each day on Facebook, if you had to guess? Yeah, some high number. So about 700, and this isn't what's posted, but what's posted and shared with others. About 700,000 pieces of content, including health information and health-related information. How many tweets a day do you think go out? Close. About 500 million tweets in a day. And per minute, how much new content is uploaded to YouTube? Per minute. So 100 hours of YouTube content per minute gets uploaded. And how often do you think a new blog is created and launched? Every 30 seconds. It's actually every half second, it's estimated, that there's a new blog out there. So when you think about how much information is circulating at any given moment, the opportunity for our patients and our communities to encounter misinformation is pretty good. And there's no way we can possibly keep track of all of this misinformation that's circulating when it comes to our patients' health and the health of our communities. So what do we do? Well, it's definitely been an interesting time, the time of fake news, the time of alternative facts. The word of the year in 2016 was post-truth, which is relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential than appeals to emotion and personal beliefs. Now, there have been questions raised, is this a war on science? It's been concerning, and those of us in public health and medicine recognize that, you know, the idea of misinformation or fake news is nothing new to us. It might be new and more mainstream. There's an awareness, I think a growing awareness. But for us, especially with the lessons we've learned with vaccinations, misinformation is nothing new. So we think about, you know, the 10 great public health achievements, vaccines is up there at number 1. Does anybody recognize this study? Yeah. Do you recognize it?
I'm not sure if it's that one, but when we people
Yeah.
I can see they are popping out all kind of.
Okay. So you see studies popping up in kind of, as you said, anti-vaccine groups or vaccine-hesitant networks. So this is the original Wakefield studies. I see you nodding. And what was that?
Yeah, this is the one that was retracted later, I believe.
Yes. It was retracted. Yes, he lost his license. But nonetheless, we saw recently one of the largest outbreaks of measles in the US in nearly a generation. A lot of that was traced back to families opting out based on personal belief exemptions in vaccinating their children because of the concern of the link, as we know, is not justified by evidence, but the concern of a link between vaccines and autism. Families opted out. They didn't vaccinate their children. Traced it back to Disneyland, and we saw an outbreak in the US. And so misinformation is causing real harm. It's making kids sick. Most of the hospitalizations were infants who were too young to be vaccinated during that US outbreak. So it's a real problem. And you know, we see celebrities and new voices and new influencers continuing to kind of perpetuate these myths and this misinformation in very unhealthy ways. And now the concerns about vaccines over the years have ballooned. It's not just autism. It's all kinds of other concerns now that the CDC is addressing directly on their website that advocacy groups and parents are asking about on a regular basis. And despite a lot of counter efforts and publishing of new evidence to dispel these myths and concerns, we see this effort to really kind of put this misinformation to rest largely ineffective. And why is that? Well, I'm going to talk to you about another example. It hasn't been quite as widely publicized, but it's a regular in my daily life in dentistry. So dental cavity is the most prevalent disease in the world, and the most well-studied and most highly recognized population-based intervention for preventing cavities is community water fluoridation, also a public health great. And does anybody recognize this study by chance? So we saw something very similar in the community water fluoridation groups where another study was published. It recommended, based on the review of a series of studies a couple years ago. Most of those studies were done in China. And this study, based on that review, recommended that fluoride be named a neurodevelopmental toxin for children. Now, this was widely contested. There were additional follow-up articles saying they didn't feel that those claims were necessarily backed by the data. But nonetheless, within 24 hours of the release of that study, this is what happened over the weekend. Thousands and thousands of views and shares with the headline that we're poisoning children's brains, that we're putting the next generation in danger using one of the most proven public health interventions to date. This is a huge problem. And now we see advocacy groups and bloggers and all kinds of anti-fluoridation groups popping up, advocating to cease water fluoridation in their communities and naming this study as justification for that. Now, the study noted limitations. A lot of them were done outside the US in naturally high occurring fluoride rates in the water that, in fact, we don't even really have here in the US. The authors stated themselves that findings from their studies could not be extrapolated and applied to community water fluoridation here, but nonetheless, we continue to see this cited as direct reasons why communities want to end fluoridation here in the United States. And just like with vaccinations, our counter efforts have not been as effective as we'd like to see. And so we're really trying to figure out why. Why is that when our efforts to bring more evidence, better evidence to correct this information are not working the way we would like to see that happen? So this brings me to our research. Media Cloud is a joint project between the Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society and MIT's Center for Civic Media, the Media Lab. And essentially, we map the internet around a given topic. So we have a platform. It's open source. And a lot of what we're doing is building it to be very user-friendly so others can do this kind of work. But we can enter and look at a topic and look at how it's being talked about online, who's talking about it, and what are they saying. And what can we learn from that to better understand why our counter-information efforts are not as effective as we'd hope. So here you can see this is the Community Water Fluoridation Information Network on the internet. This is what it looks like visually. So that is the NCBI website where abstracts for NIH-funded and related research are published, where you can go and read these abstracts. That's where the original study lives online. So we thought we would learn about this information network and see what information spread looks like. So there's the day that that study was published, before it took off across mainstream media as the government's poisoning children. And we see that it got picked up by an anti-fluoridation advocacy group who linked to the abstract and referenced new research shows that it's a neurotoxin, that fluoride's a neurotoxin. But they alter their narrative. They link to the abstract to show they're using science, and yet the limitations of the study are not acknowledged. The broader context of literature and how that study does or does not contribute to the growing evidence that we have is not mentioned. And a new narrative is created around this study. Then we see a popular YouTuber, not in the health field, not in public health, not in science, but has a large following on YouTube and has a family and cares about issues that impact her family, picks up on not the study itself, but the advocacy group talking about the study. So the narrative moves forward, but the evidence starts to shift with that moving narrative as information starts moving. And this blogger starts spreading concerning messages to all her viewers. Video bloggers and then we see a newspaper in Texas picks it up because at the time we did this map, Dallas, Texas was looking to vote on whether to end water fluoridation for the city or not. And so there was a lot of online activity around the Texas discussion. And so we picked up a newspaper, a pretty well-known newspaper in that region, who linked back to these advocacy groups. They linked to some of the science, to the CDC's page, but then in an effort to be fair and balanced and show both sides, started linking, and the narrative continued to travel that fluoride is a poison for children's brains, despite the evidence not really supporting that narrative. And then before we know it, a small local newspaper picks up on the story, and we see communities voting to end water fluoridation, all leading back to unsubstantiated claims directly linked to how misinformation spreads. Very similar to the vaccine story, similar patterns. And so what do we do about this? So we noticed when we mapped out this network that this particular narrative kind of clustered in one part of the map. So we see that it's all kind of down here in this lower right-hand corner, meaning those who are linking to this narrative based on its use of language and how people are talking about fluoridation all kind of clustered. And so we did the same thing with vaccinations. We mapped out the vaccine information network, and you can see by the color coding, we saw the same clustering behavior. And these sources are tending to link to each other because they're sharing language, they're sharing sentiment around the topics at hand. So they're linking to each other more often than to other sources. So we thought this is almost like the behaviors we see in social networks, right? But this is the World Wide Web, but we're still seeing kind of this clustering social behavior happening. And in fact, one of our most striking findings from our vaccination study is that we saw this pink cluster. That's where most of us are. That's the health and science community. That's where the discussion around evidence and the body of work really was happening. You see CDC in there. And so we thought, is that kind of an isolated public health medicine network within the broader information network? And that might explain why it's hard to post counter evidence to scary headlines like this. The HPV vaccine is a silent epidemic of medical violence. That's pretty scary. And this might explain why our counter efforts are largely ineffective. Are we just talking to ourselves? And we did several studies. We've now done over 150 case studies, and we see this clustering behavior almost every single time. And almost every single time, we find kind of an isolated public health and medicine community within the larger network. So our suspicion is we're really good at talking to each other and linking to ourselves, but getting these messages out to the broader information network has been trickier than we even realized. So our question is, how do we break out of these echo chambers and effectively reach broader audiences? And I think we're dealing with a phenomenon that we're kind of naming social proof. Social proof is nothing new, but thinking about it in terms of science communication could be. And what is social proof? Well, lots of people are sharing this. People you like share it. Your own peers share it. You share it. And before we know it, fluoride damages children's brains. Vaccines cause autism. No science required. No scientific proof needed. The social proof is enough, right? And so what do we do when we have such value in the scientific evidence, but it's social proof that seems to really move messages? And that's where we're thinking about new communication strategies, moving from broadcast diffusion, where we work really hard on our evidence-based, very well-vetted, drafted and redrafted messages and broadcast them to the wide world, the World Wide Web, or we start thinking about social diffusion, where we rely on the sharing momentum of social networks, which means we need to appeal to the norms and values of all these various clusters that we're identifying on the web, not just our own public health community where we all speak the same language. So we're really rethinking health communication, science communication in public health. And we're moving from how can we get our evidence-based information out to our target audiences, which is the question that we ask every day when it comes to communicating evidence, right? But we're starting to think maybe we need to be asking, how can we get our audiences to share our evidence-based information? And that is an entirely different communication strategy than broadcast communication. Relying on sharing momentum really requires us to take more of a social network approach to health communication. And so we're starting to play with various approaches and continuing to explore ways for additional research. And we've nicknamed this exploratory stage the I Care approach, where the core of what we're doing is really appealing to the identity of these various networks. And how they identify is going to be different depending on each cluster in these networks. We work on building connections. Oh, you have concerns for your child. I'm a mother too. I understand that. We work on anecdotes, telling stories. We request more information. Why did that particular blog resonate? Was it from your neighbor and you trust that person? And the evidence. As we know, evidence speaks volumes if that's a shared value with our audiences. But for some, it's more about building trust and having connections. So really, what I've talked about today is nothing new. The idea of storytelling to communicate science is not a new approach, but we're able to map out these online communities and visualize this in ways that we haven't before, and it's really opening the door for us to become innovative and creative in how we communicate science with our audiences, especially when it comes to combating myths and misinformation. So I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, and he's going to dive into a more specific example and some of his approaches. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And I'm going to discuss more about HPV vaccinations. And why am I talking about HPV vaccination? We saw from Brittany that the #1 cause of where we have the most misinformation in any healthcare topic is exactly vaccination. And HPV is a topic that is dear to me. And when we look at the numbers related to HPV, we know that HPV is the most common sexually transmitted infection in this country. If you look at the numbers carefully, every year in the United States, about 27,000 of cancers are caused by persistent HPV infection. And if we translate this number in how many per minute, we see that one person every minute can be diagnosed with an HPV-positive cancer in the United States. And let's look at this table carefully. When we see the different types of cancers that are caused by HPV, we see that about 91% of cancer of the cervical area are caused by persistent human papillomavirus infection. The same numbers, we see them in anal cancer and rectal cancer. And when we look at the oropharynx, I'm a dentist by training, so I'm very, very interested in this topic. We see that about 70% of oropharyngeal cancers are now caused by an HPV infection. So I took some time and look at the media, and I was Googling about HPV. And if you Google HPV, you'll see that there are about 27 million results on Google. And if you narrow down this search on HPV and dentist role, you see that there are about 1 million results on this topic. So it's a huge, huge topic right now. And the HPV vaccine was initially approved by the FDA in 2006, and there was growing interest in the media since then. We know that in 2013, for example, Michael Douglas, the actor, was diagnosed with an HPV-positive oropharyngeal cancer. It was in the news. It was everywhere. It was on CNN. It was on Time magazine. There was a huge discussion about oral sex and oral HPV infections. And in the past year, there has been also growing interest in the media about specifically oral HPV infections and the role of HPV vaccination. So I want to go into some practical examples. So if you Google HPV and HPV vaccination specifically, you see that there is a lot of good evidence-based information about the vaccine, but we also have false information and lots of questions about HPV vaccination. Let's see a couple of them. The first one is that the vaccine was not properly tested, and there are no proven information and data that HPV vaccination can prevent HPV-associated cancers. And this is everywhere. When you Google HPV vaccination, you'll see it everywhere. But the truth is that before the approval of the vaccine in 2006, there was a large clinical trial, multi-center, with more than 20,000 women enrolled, which proved the efficacy of HPV vaccination in preventing HPV-related cervical infections. Let's look at a second myth that we can find in the media. The HPV vaccine causes more serious side effects than any other vaccine. And again, this is not true. We see that in the United States, since 2006, 18 million doses of vaccine were delivered, and yet the adverse reactions were the usual that we see also for other vaccinations. So again, it's a myth against a fact. And specifically in this country, there are multiple organizations and associations that monitor the vaccine safety. These are the same for any vaccine that is available in the United States. We have the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and all of them are or have some sort of collaboration or association with the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta and also the FDA. So the common side effects that we see with HPV vaccinations are exactly the same that we see with other approved vaccines. And usually they are erythema in the site of injection. Patients may develop a little bit of fever in the first 48 hours, sometimes nausea, but it's relatively safe, and there are safety data. I included some of the references here, and we have huge, huge data on the safety for the HPV vaccine. And the benefits definitely outweigh the risk in this case because this vaccine has been proven to be effective in preventing cervical cancers, vaginal cancer, and vulvar cancers. It has potential also to prevent oropharyngeal cancers and penile cancer in men. So just to refresh your memory, I want to go over the HPV dosing schedule. The CDC recommends 2 doses for children, both boys and girls, before their 15th birthday, and the dose is given at 6 to 12 months apart. In cases where patients are immunocompromised, again, under the age of 15, the vaccine should be given in 3 doses series, 1 at month 0, after 1 or 2 months, and then after 6 months. Things are a little bit different if patients are over the age of 15 and under the age of 26, where the CDC recommends, again, 3 doses, 1 at month 0, 1 after 1 or 2 months, and the final dose after 6 months. So just to give you a little bit of summary, the HPV vaccination is nowadays recommended for all children, boys and girls, starting the age of 9. The ideal window is age 11 to 12, but it's also available up to the age of 26. And we are lucky enough here in Massachusetts to have this vaccine available for free. The CDC has the best information on HPV vaccination. So if we need to advise one of our patients or the parents of our patients, we should direct them to the CDC portal, because the CDC has information not only for healthcare providers, but specific information for patients and the parents. And they're really simple, easy to read, and they are updated typically every 6 months. So if we want to look at the efficacy of this vaccination, it will take years to see late outcomes. And we are starting to see this regarding cervical cancer. It will take a little bit longer for oropharyngeal cancers because the vaccine was initially approved for girls and then was approved for boys later on. And we know that oropharyngeal cancer is mostly prevalent and seen in boys. So we'll see late outcomes for HPV-related oropharyngeal cancers in a few years from now. But we nowadays know that early outcomes, we start to see these from the HPV vaccination, and we see that HPV vaccine is effective in prevention of HPV-related warts, and also in the oral and vaginal prevalence of HPV infections. So we are starting to see already some good data about the efficacy of the HPV vaccine. Let's look at this graph for a second. Here we see the vaccination coverage in the United States from 2006 up to 2016. And we see that about 90% of adolescents received at least 1 dose of Tdap or 1 dose of the meningococcus vaccine. If we look down here at the HPV vaccination, we see the rates of vaccination are way, way lower, almost half of what we see in Tdap. And this is telling us 2 things. One is that we're not doing a good job in providing correct information on HPV as healthcare providers. And the second thing that this graph is telling us is that the majority of patients are seeing a healthcare provider, so much so that 90% are receiving at least 1 vaccine. And this is a good news because it means that we need to reach out to these healthcare providers and provide good information about the HPV vaccination. So what are the reasons why parents want to initiate an HPV vaccine? Most of the reasons are listed here. Some of them think that their children are not sexually active. Some of them have safety concern. We talked about misinformation in the media about the HPV vaccination. And then still, in a good 15% of the cases, it's because it's not recommended by the healthcare provider. So we really need to focus on healthcare providers in doing a better job in promoting HPV vaccination. And if we look at the value that parents place on the vaccine from a scale 0 to 10, we see that all the vaccines available, including the HPV vaccine, has a good value for the parents. So again, why is that the number of people vaccinated are still so low when a parents put the same value of a meningitis vaccine? Let's look at the clinician estimation. So in this study from a group of Texas, they asked clinicians, what do you think is the value for certain vaccine types of the parents of your patients? And they guessed pretty much okay for meningitis, hepatitis, and pertussis vaccination. But if we look at the HPV vaccination, they thought that parents were not putting enough value on HPV vaccination, which is not true because we saw from the previous slide that the value that parents put on HPV vaccination is exactly the same as for the other vaccines. So same way, same day. What does it mean? Whenever we want to promote a vaccine or there is an immunization program, we need to promote the vaccine, HPV vaccination, the same way that we promote other vaccines, and the same day. I want to focus 1 second on this slide. The word today, it's really, really important because whenever a healthcare provider promotes or initiates a vaccination in one of their patients, they start and do that the same day that they see the patient. The same thing should be done for an HPV vaccination. So the HPV vaccine should be sandwiched in between the meningitis vaccine and the pertussis vaccine. And again, the focus here is the prevention of cancer. So we should be able to talk directly to our patients and the parents of our patients about the potential of preventing certain cancer. And we know that it does prevent cervical and vulvar cancer. So this is another example that can be used in providing good information to our patients. We are all familiar with the helmet. When we go biking, we all wear the helmet. And so should we wear the helmet before we go biking or before our children go for a ride? Should we wear it while we are riding the bike? Or should we wait for an accident and then we're going to start wearing the helmet? The same thing should be done with the vaccination. Are we going to vaccine our children before the exposure, after the exposure, or during the exposure? And parents really understand this well. The same example that we could use would be the seat belt. Is the same thing. Should we put on our seat belt before turning on the car, after we leave the car, after we leave the driveway, or after we have an accident? It's the same story. So I'm a dentist by training, and so what is our role? Why are we talking about vaccination? Why are we talking about misinformation? And this is because we talked about HPV specifically today. We said that about 70% of the oropharyngeal cancers are caused by an HPV infection. And if you look at the numbers of estimated cases of oral and oropharyngeal cancers this year, these numbers were released a few weeks ago by the American Cancer Society. We see that about 51,000 new cases of oral and oropharyngeal cancer will occur this year in the United States. And this is a pretty high number. And oropharyngeal cancers represent 4% of all the cancers in the United States among men. And we saw that HPV cancer rates are rising, about 31,500 per every year. Oropharyngeal cancer rates are becoming higher than cervical cancer rates. And we have a tool that has the potential to prevent these cancers. And patients visit the dentist more frequently than primary care physicians. So we really have the potential to provide good information to both our patients and the parents of our little ones. This is just to show you a few clinical cases of HPV-related disease in the head and neck area. We see on the top right a classic sign of oropharyngeal cancer, a lump in the throat. There is a role also for potentially malignant disorders, just a small subset, but we know that some leukoplakias can be caused by an HPV infection. And then HPV can cause common warts, same that we see on the skin. We can see the same disease in the mouth. Here we have some cases of HPV-related benign conditions. We have a squamous papilloma, verruca vulgaris, and condyloma cuminatum. So all of these are caused by persistent HPV infections. A recent paper was just published on the Journal of the American Dental Association, where they showed that some dentists discussed about HPV already and the association with oropharyngeal cancer. And most of the oral healthcare providers perform an oral cancer screening. So if we educate our oral healthcare providers about HPV and HPV vaccination, we may have the potential to reach out to more patients and then prevent this deadly condition. So we talked about the increasing in the interest of HPV in the media. This is just one of the examples that just came out a few days ago. It was published on the Daily Mail, where they show that dentists may soon start asking about your sex life, about HPV. And this is another one that came out again a few days ago on January 20th, where they say that at your next dental appointment could come with an STD as throat cancer rise. But I wanted to show you this practical example. I'm going to show you exactly what it was written in this article, because again, we saw that misinformation is there, and we need to be able to recognize what is good information and what is bad information. So what they mentioned in this paper, which is available online, is that by 2030, there will be more patients with mouth cancers due to HPV compared to cervical cancer. Is this true or is this not true? It's not true, and the reason is because it's not mouth cancer that it's raising, but it's oropharyngeal cancer. Let's look at another sentence. You've got to be careful what you talk about. Talking to a 20-year-old about safe sex would probably not be the smartest thing to do. Is this information correct? Is this the right approach to talk about HPV in a patient? It's not 100% correct. Let's look at another sentence. Every dentist should be screening patients not only for oral cancer, but for HPV. And this is true, and most of the dentists already perform an oral cancer screening, but they should also start talking about HPV, and they can talk about signs and symptoms about HPV and vaccination. So what does it mean? I want to conclude with some reflection points, starting specifically from this article that I found online a few days ago. Was this misinformation, or was this a correct information? Was it good information or bad information? And in a way, this was misinformation, because what they're stating here is that HPV causes oral cancer, whereas we know that it causes less than 5% of oral cancer, but more than 70% of oropharyngeal cancer, which is different. But this misinformation, did it lead to a bad outcome? What was the final goal of this paper? The final goal was to increase awareness among dentists about HPV and make sure that dentists and oral healthcare providers in general provide a good oral screening exam. So again, was this paper focused on oral cancer? Was on oropharyngeal cancer? Was on both? Again, this is just a small example to show you that there is a lot of information out there, that we need to be careful about what's out there, and we need to be able also to direct our patients and the parents of our patients, if we want to talk about HPV, to the right and correct information. And finally, if the bad information is out there, us as healthcare providers, we need to guide our patients and fill in the gaps to make sure they receive the correct information. So with this one, I want to conclude. I know I left some questions open. This is where I'm from. I'm from Italy, so I like always to show the place where I was born. And we are going to be happy to answer any questions.
Congratulations, beautiful lecture, both of you. I was particularly impressed by the map of information that you actually were able to gather, because I think that's exactly where we have to act. As an example, in Italy right now there is elections coming, and there is a political party who is advocating against the vaccines. And I found that the most effective way to actually fight that is to prevent, rather than actually going on the social media and saying, the vaccine works, you're wrong. You'll never be able to change the opinion of those people. They will never change their mind. On the social media, it's clearly evident they reply, they say, you're wrong, I'm right. But the right way to do it is exactly what you're doing, I think, because if you identify the map and you can intercept a message preventing, then you may not change the mind of people that are already convinced, but then you prevent those that are going to change eventually their mind. So I really think that that's the way to go. I mean, what do you think?
Thank you for the comment. Can you all hear me still? Okay, my mic slipped down, so I had to put it back. So you said a couple of things that we've actually identified, that corrective information is largely ineffective, and the research in the vaccinations example has backed that up. And in fact, corrective information tends to make people hold on to those beliefs even stronger. So going out and saying, you're wrong, here's the evidence, is largely counterproductive. And you know, the data has shown that, and we're starting to figure out a little bit more about why. So I actually think you're right on, and thanks for saying that you think we're right on too. I'll just add, you know, the way we are starting to think about the internet is one large dinner party where there are multiple different peer groups sitting at tables. And if you think about entering a room where there's a dinner party going on and you hear conversations about topics that are interesting you, and you go in and start like your slide with the adolescent vaccination rates, and you bring in, I mean, this beautiful data graph that we all would love and drool over, right? Beautiful data graphics are our favorite thing in public health. But you go to a dinner party and you sit down where there are people that are already friends having a conversation and bring your data. That's weird. Like, that would be very strange. It's not socially acceptable to go and insert yourself into a conversation with strangers in real life at a dinner party. And we think the internet functions like that. It's a very social environment where people they end up in those clusters not by accident, but because they share these social values and end up there through connections and people they already know. And so if we, on the internet, come with our counter information and pretty graphs and say, you're wrong, and sit at the table and invite it, we're rejected. That's a total social norm violation. So, you know, we're kind of working on that theory now and thinking about the dinner party example, that if we want to sit down at the table, we need to be invited. And in order to be invited, we need to make connections, we need to share some values with folks, and then get invited to sit down and be part of the conversation. And that's a very social behavior and something that's quite different than our usual approach. So I think, you know, I agree with you.
Yeah, so I have a question here from Facebook. Is the adult male population eligible for the HPV vaccine? So the HPV vaccine is recommended until the age of 26. And the reason why is that because by that time, patients or individuals in general maybe have already infected with HPV. HPV is, and I'm going to answer also another question. They were asking about how does one develop HPV infection? So HPV infection is usually, I'm talking about oral HPV infection, is usually through oral sex, but it's through skin-to-skin contact. So from the genital area to the oral cavity. And the second reason why it's not recommended in the adult population is because, again, it's not a therapeutic vaccine. It's a preventative vaccine, so it prevents from developing new infection. And the second reason why it's not right now recommended in the adult population is that because the immune response, the antibody response that we see to the HPV vaccine in the adult population is not as good as the one that we see in children, which is true for the majority of the vaccines that are available nowadays. But things may change. There are some recent data, actually, that show that it may have also a therapeutic effect on new HPV infections, but only a couple of papers came out, so it's too early to say. And then,
Thank you for a beautiful talk, both of you. Dr. Landrigan is a classmate of mine, that first paper you showed. And he told me recently, he was up here, that he doesn't believe that anymore. So how do you get that message out, particularly since the bulletin of the T.H. Chan School of Public Health had also a similar anti-fluoridation article that was rescinded? Big problem. The other issue, I'll put on my medical dental integration hat. Physicians can give dental injections. If dentists could give HPV vaccinations, we'd be in better shape.
So both, which one should we go after first? Both components. So, you made my week. That's great to hear that there's been a shifting perspective from an author. I think we're often authors of publications, it's humbling to say I was wrong. I think the more comfortable we get as researchers in acknowledging that and being more transparent with the broader public about when we're wrong, could assist in opening the conversation and making it feel more like a social two-way street, which is the way people use the internet today. It's a very bi-directional medium. And by, acknowledging being wrong is not a bad thing in research. It just strengthens our work. It allows us to continue to nail down, drill down where the best evidence truly is, and that's part of the scientific process. So, authors being transparent about shifting opinions, even of their own work, I think could really assist in kind of bringing people into the conversation. But it's difficult. I mean, as we've seen, once the information's out there, it's really difficult to bring it back in. If he was willing to kind of create a story around this and talk about his experience as a person, I published this thing and it had these unintended consequences and I've actually revised my own views and here I am today, that's a powerful story that could resonate with people. Where it becomes not just about the data, which again is what we love, but also about the story of information and how it shifts and how we use it in our communities.
Yeah, the second part.
I have a suggestion together with a question that comes after that, a little bit on different topic. The suggestion is, since a lot of the information, the scientific basis of this kind of hysterical movement is from the science, why not request that NIH-funded researchers submit a lay summary the way we do for grants? And so you could go and you could get into that NIH website and you may see the abstract, but you see a pop-up window that'll tell you in simple terms what it means. Don't let someone else say that. So that was a simple thing. So a way like vaccinate if you want the network, avoid the spread of the information. So that's a simple solution to essentially avoiding manipulation and biases in the way it's presented. The other aspect of this is there's a flip side to the story, though. The social media could be used to detect negative outcomes, if you want, unexpected, from some intervention. You would think, okay, well, fluoride doesn't cause breathing, but a new drug or a new vaccine may come and cause side effect. And because there's a social media, we may not have to wait until we see something like thalidomide or what the COX-2 inhibitor causes, tens of thousands of cardiovascular events. And yet, there is no evidence for the positive side of the social media. So we see hysteria and wrong information. We don't see evidence that the social media has helped in actually eliminating, not every intervention is successful. And we don't see the positive side. And I was going to ask you, why is that? Why isn't there? I mean, you could have, if you want, the negative side is hysteria, unjustified. The positive side may be, yes, we do find earlier than we take. We don't have to wait for tens of thousands of people to die or suffer a side effect. And we don't see that. Why is it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a classic example with the flu, and that Twitter can actually end up helping to predict outbreaks, and some of that research, I believe, came out of HMS. And I'm not directly working on that, but there are members of our team who are very interested looking at how can we utilize social media for these positive reasons to help us kind of crowdsource data in ways that were never possible before. So I think you're onto something, and there are people very interested in that. That's difficult to do. Maybe I am a pessimist. I have a lot I still want to know, but I'm not sure social media is the place for that to happen. I don't know. This is relatively new. I mean, social media is new. When you look at the history of medicine and vaccinations and public health, we have decades and even centuries of information. Social media is a decade, a little older, that's brand new. So there's a lot of questions that we still have to answer. But there's a whole kind of body of work underway with, I think, a lot of potential positive answers.
You want to ask another question?
I have a question. Can I go now? Okay, sure. I have two questions. One, I'm seeing from a various group of a very strong blog of anti-vaccine, which also works with the fluoridation and HPV others. So I moved here from upstate New York, and few of my friends there, they're currently preventing. It's like a more, the thing we are thinking and talking, no, they are in work. They are preventing their kids from getting those HPV vaccination. Plus, even they're like a very strong advocate for anti-vaccine, getting vaccine for the pregnancy, they're losing pregnancy. So those are all misinformation is like rapidly spreading. And it's not, I think something needs to do about it to get, otherwise all those diseases like polio and others might come back again. This is one question. And the second one, if I am in a blog, is there any site or anything we can, bring up and then show this is nothing? Because there is a strong anti-vaccine group, but there is no advocate for vaccine group because this is like a normal. So this is there anywhere, because there is no writing and no publication, yes, the vaccines work because this is normal, it works. So there is nothing you can counter them with any publication, because the news is when it doesn't work, but there is no news that the vaccine works or vaccine is not harmful. So this is one thing. And another, I'm not an anti-vaccine or something. So is the adult normal immune system person does need to have fluoride vaccine every year? Doesn't you think that they getting everybody the fluoride vaccine is bringing the this flu virus more and more mutated and bringing it stronger? That's my second question. Thanks.
I'm not a flu vaccine expert. I just study what people say about it online, so I'm not sure about that. Did you have any comments about this?
Not on the flu vaccine either, yeah. But I can tell you for the first part of the question, and maybe you can integrate as well, that at least here in New England, we are working together with the Department of Public Health, primary care physician, pediatricians, and dentists to make sure that they are trained on how to deliver the message related specifically on HPV vaccination. And we have these questions all the time because parents typically read blogs, they read the news, and they see this misinformation. But it's proven that if you talk about this HPV vaccine starting from cancer prevention standpoint, I gave you the example of the sandwich in between two other vaccines. This is very effective, and typically then the parents say yes to the vaccine on the same day. So I think that we need to start, and again, I'm speaking about the HPV vaccination, but I think that we need to start small with the people that can provide the vaccine. We know from the data that 90% of the patients do go to either the dentist or the healthcare provider, the primary care or the pediatrician. So we have the occasion really to work with the parents and to give them the right information about the vaccine. On the other hand, there are lots of bad information about the HPV vaccine, but there are also good information. So I showed you a couple of examples of CNN, the Daily Mail, and right now, specifically this past year, there has been a huge promotion regarding immunization programs on HPV, also from media in general. So yes, there are bad information, but there are also good information that are easily accessible to the public. But I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, you brought up a lot of good points, but I think one challenge that we do have, especially when we talk about prevention, is a non-event is a success. And how do you make a story out of a non-event?
Right.
I walked out the door today and nothing happened. I mean, that's really boring if you're trying to make headlines. So that's, yeah, I think that that is a challenge. How do we create a story when nothing happens?
I'm not sure I agree with you that it's a non-event. I mean,
Well, yes.
in the sense that you could be in the defensive and say it's a non-event, but you could also, in the social media, say, well, cervical cancer is the 9th or 8th cancer in women in this country, and it's the first or second in countries that don't have that. That's an event.
That is.
And so people forget. So the issue of sensational information, it's very good to excite people, tell them, oh, you're going to get these vaccines, it's going to cause brain damage or cause all kind of, that's exciting, right?
Yeah.
And the excitement is not you take the vaccine and you won't have brain damage. That's not that exciting. But what is exciting, though, is that the rate of cancer is 5% where it is where the vaccine is not.
So to you, that's very exciting. That's data. That's why we have a pink circle with all our case studies. So I'll push back again. I agree with you. There's a way we need to make that feel personal, though, because this is the other challenge with social media. With population-based interventions, we talk in data and statistics and population numbers. Social media is hyper-personalized. I get on my Facebook page, and they know the outfit I bought my daughter last week. And they're like, look, you might like these shoes to go with it. And it's creepy almost how these platforms know exactly not what all of us like, but what I personally like to the T, to the color, to the size. So when we bring data into the discussion, I think on these platforms, we need to get creative in how to hyper-personalize that statistic that you just said, not why it matters to the group and to the country relative to that country, but why it matters to you. And that's what motivates people to then share that, because they feel compelled, it resonated with that person. And that's, I think, the challenge. So I completely agree with you, but that's why on these platforms we have access to millions of people, but everyone's on there because it provides them an experience that's all about them and just for them. Any one experience is going to be different than any other experience.
We have another question up here.
Thinking back to the early slides that you showed, I think you had listed a number of great accomplishments. And if I remember right, you had automobile fatalities also listed up there. And we know that the breakthrough with lowering mortality from automobile accidents happened at the point that it stopped being optional. Seatbelts became mandatory, airbags became mandatory, and probably in the future we'll see things like self-driving collision prevention becoming mandatory. So my question, I think you already know, is what do you think of the nuclear option with some legislature to make vaccines mandatory?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, we could all weigh in on that one. And that's where prevention and policy intersect. I mean, this is exactly why we have these conversations and why policy is key to public health successes. All of those successes were directly linked to policies in place to help them get there. And then you look at what California went through after the measles outbreak, and they've eliminated personal belief exemptions. So, I think that there's some thinking there is what's the role of policy?
This is about established base. I can tell you that about 4 or 5 years ago, the town of Yarmouth had a anti-fluoridation campaign, and they were voting on it. And all the deans of the dental schools in Boston were asked to write letters to the Board of Selectmen, and we did. And I remember Julio Frank was the dean of the School of Public Health. He did, and Jeff Flyer signed the letter, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't work. What they didn't realize, even though they were told, was most of their water came from Otis, the Air Force Base, which is fluoridated. They chose not to take on the armed services.
Just want to thank both of you.
Thank you.
don't know if we've met. I'm Rob. I'm Elsie's husband.
Oh, okay. Nice to meet you. I'm Emily. I'm the
Emily.
intern.
Yeah, good to meet you. I hear only really good things about you.